Okay. So hi everyone. Thanks for being here. Good afternoon. I want also to extend my thanks to Christian and Olivier for organizing this series of workshops, and also obviously to Ludovic and Gilles for giving me the opportunity to share with you my research, which is based on my PhD in urban and regional planning, in which I'm tackling the financialization of urban redevelopment through a comparison of two large-scale regeneration projects, one of them being located in the Lyon City region. I'll talk more about the specific case. So I'm only going to talk about one out of the two cases that my PhD is based on. And yes, I'm going to focus more, following Rachel's argument, on the role of the urban government in the process of financialization, and in that case, in the role of the Metropolitan Authority, and more specifically, the role of the mayor, Gérard Collomb, and the economic development staff, which has been really involved in trying to sell the city region as a premium value, not only to the world, but to financial markets and to property investors. So as you may have gathered, my research does not primarily deal with financialization nor with neoliberalization, as I am more interested in the ongoing and deepening integration between the urban built environment, including in my case office buildings, and financial markets. Nevertheless, as I'm going to argue, given that in urban entrepreneurialism there is such an emphasis on real estate as a means of economic development and as a means of planning and bringing urban regeneration, we need to understand financialization if we want to get a glimpse, not explain everything about internationalization, but get a glimpse of how it can unfold in a specific city region which follows this urban entrepreneurial agenda. So, as we have said, neoliberalization is a highly contested concept. It's very contradictory. It has its own shortcomings. It has been very much debated. Although one thing on which scholars generally agree is that it can be understood as the shift from managerialism to urban entrepreneurialism, and this is of course Harvey's famous article in '89, although at that time it did not make explicitly the relationship with neoliberalism or neoliberalization, which he only did later, because in this article Harvey talks more about flexible accumulation. So there is this great narrative about how the shift to a more flexible capitalist accumulation involves a deepening of interurban competition, whereby cities increasingly embark on an international, global scale to compete against other cities to attract capital, businesses, and upper classes through what he calls public-private partnerships and through what can be understood as supply-side policies really aimed at attracting all these resources. And in that regard, I think the most stereotypical case we have in the French context is the Lyon City region, given that there has been a continuous and stable emphasis on an urban entrepreneurial agenda which is aimed at boosting the local economy, as Jouve once said, through the promotion of its international dimension. So this is the case I'm going to focus about. And this is a stable agenda despite partisanship change. And this overarching competitive and growth-oriented agenda has a strong international dimension to it. So originally in '89, there was this idea from shifting the scale of the competition, not competing against Paris, but competing on the European second cities. In 2001, Gérard Collomb ran on a platform in which he recoded and reinvented this agenda by labeling it the top 15. The idea being that you have these European second cities, the top 15, of which Barcelona, Milan, Frankfurt, Manchester are part, and he wants Lyon to be part of this very small club of good and competitive cities. And some of these cities, of course, are competitors, but they can also be role models on which there is things to, from which, sorry, there are things to learn. In that respect, it's interesting to note that Barcelona is not only represents not only competition, but a role model for Lyon, and not only in terms of the urban regeneration agenda of Barcelona, focused on culture and tourism, but also in terms of being able to compete and perform as well as Barcelona in city rankings. And a third aspect of the international dimension of this entrepreneurial agenda is the design, for example, of a label, the Only Lyon label, which was used in international fairs and expos, such as the MIPIM in 2010. And I'll return to the specific example of the MIPIM later in the presentation. The guiding thread, I'd like to argue, the common elements linking these three different elements is that they are all used by the Metropolitan Authority to attract real estate capital and real estate developers. Indeed, I would like to argue in this session, following Haila's idea of the politics of the global city, that entrepreneurialism not only, of course, as Harvey said, involves interurban competition, but it involves attracting businesses, investment, but a specific kind of investment, which is real estate capital. In a critique of Sassen's concept of the global city, Haila suggested that we should stop thinking about what is a global city and who is a global city, who isn't a global city, but we should start instead thinking of the politics of the global cities, which she says are very much distinguished by an emphasis on real estate and real estate investment within the shift to urban-based accumulation, as Ozan talked about earlier. And she says that the politics of the global city, quotes, informs the investors that the city follows the familiar rules of the real estate game. The investor is persuaded further by the presence of buildings appropriate as objects of investment. So there seems to be a specific connection between urban entrepreneurialism and real estate. And I would argue with Ayla that so we need to understand what the rules of the real estate games are. And as Rachel just suggested, these rules have evolved for the past decades, given the intensifying integration between real estate markets and financial markets. And in my case, it's not, in the French case, it's not so much about the securitization, which is not that developed as a market. It's more about how various urban items, take for example the office near the train station or large infrastructure, all these different urban items are being bought and by professional investors, fund and asset managers, who then lease them to businesses in order to have a secure cash flow and to have future revenues. So given the emphasis on attracting real estate investment capital in this entrepreneurial politics and policies of the global city, I will argue that we can grasp maybe some aspects of internationalization by understanding financialization. And I'm going to use the case of the Lyon City region, in which in 2001, when Gérard Collomb, the local socialist leader, was elected for the first time, so he has been elected in 2001, and then he has been elected twice since, and he's still in office. He ran on a platform which was based on the idea that to get growth, you need to have businesses, and that businesses need a new supply of offices. Therefore, you need a new supply of offices, and since these offices are usually bought by portfolio and fund managers, you need to attract this portfolio and fund managers, all these financial investors, to the Lyon City region. And in order to do so, there was this policies aimed at selling the Lyon City region as a premium value to the world, which means selling the idea to these property investors that the city region with a new property supply is going to be offering new assets that they're gonna be able to buy, and assets that provides them with steady returns. So the idea is really to sell the city region as a low risk return markets for investors. So this is sort of the overarching idea and argument of the presentation. And I'm now going to focus on 3 different aspects whereby the city region, and especially the Metropolitan Authority, has sold the city region in its market as a premium value to investors with the help of local intermediaries, local brokers on the one hand, so these professionals who help developers to sell their buildings to investors, or who help developers or investors to find tenants so that the building is leased up. The second type of key intermediary in the case study are obviously the local developers. Local, so some of them are from the Lyon City region, and others are national French developers. So there are 3 aspects in the case study through which the city region was sold as a premium value. The first side and the first aspect is to go to this real estate forum and expos, so the MIPIM. I will be focusing on the MIPIM, which have served as a showcase, as a platform to showcase the city region, because the Metropolitan Authority exhibited its portfolio of projects to various investors coming to this property fair at Cannes each year. The second aspect of selling is not about only selling and showcasing, but enforcing, making sure that the investment requirements of these fund and asset managers are being implemented within different urban regeneration projects. And here I'll be focusing on a specific project, which is the Cara de Soie. And the third aspect is about upscaling. It came with the design of a metropolitan strategy in 2008, which was about essentially making sure that there was no competition between these different projects, and that the Metropolitan Authority was able to guarantee the investors that there won't be over-construction, there won't be an oversupply, because they were, the Metropolitan Authority was bound to make sure that there was no, that they would control through their urban planning powers the supply of new properties, so that the risk-return requirements of investors were not only implemented within individual projects, but also upscaled at the metropolitan strategy. If you're not familiar with Lyon, this is just a map produced by the Metropolitan Authority. So it's the second largest, or maybe third by population, largest city region in France. It's obviously, as you can see, at the heart of Europe. It's overseen by a single metropolitan authority, which is called the Greater Lyon, the Grand Lyon, which was created late in the 60s by the state. It oversees over 59 municipalities. It has various policy skills and expertise in various domains, 2 of which are specifically important for the case study here. One, because of the double aspect of commercial property, obviously, because on the one hand, offices or retail is one aspect of the urban built environment. It's one function, so that refers to more to planning and urbanism. But on the other one, it also provides businesses with a home, with a place to stay and conduct their businesses. And that's why it also appeals to the economic development policy of the Metropolitan Authority. Just a few words, just some background of the French commercial property market, which which most of the business gets done, whether in investment or leasing, most of the business gets done in Paris. Only the regional market represents only 25% of all investment flows. And of this 25, Lyon represents another 25. So basically Lyon is 1/8 of the investment market or the lease market. And you have here some figures. As you can see, most of the investment which goes to Lyon goes to offices, which are in pink, and which for the past year have been around 8,000 billions of euros. So a good place to start investigating this politics of the global city is the MIPIM, which is one of the largest property fairs. It was created in 1990 by Reed Midem. It gathers every year in March, usually at the beginning in March, currently more than 20,000 professionals. Originally, most of these professionals came from the real estate business, as MIPIM was dedicated to the real estate business professionals. But it appears that it has increasingly been colonized by local authorities, which sees the MIPIM, which consider the MIPIM as a way to tap into the funds of investors and developers who attend as well this meeting. And I think this is, you can just by looking at the picture notice that, for example, CBRE, which is a broker, is here, but you also have Istanbul, Dubai, Manchester. So this is not anymore just a place for real estate professionals, but also for local authorities, which are coming closer and closer, not only in organizational, but also in cognitive terms, with these real estate professionals, because precisely they want to attract them in order to, in the case of the Grand Lyon, generate economic growth. So when Cologne was elected, the Grand Lyon Authority, the Metropolitan Authority, had been going to the MIPIM for some years. But there was sort of a strategic turn, because the MIPIM was really seen as a key site to implement its property agenda by, once again, showcasing the city region market to local brokers, worldwide, brokers, developers, but most of all, investors, as investors are the key target of these events. So the MIPIM was really a strategic site, and this is where, and I insist, that is just one part of the story, and of course not everything happens through MIPIM, but it gives us a very good idea. The MIPIM was one of the key catalysts whereby the Metropolitan Economic Development Department and the mayor became aware and more close and closer, with the rules of the game of the real estate and with the requirements of these investment funds and property pension funds, property trusts. So there was, because it was strategic, there was a significant increase of internal resources mobilized and used by the Metropolitan Authority to exist on the MIPIM and to attract the interest from developers, but most of all from investors. In that respect, one key point which is really appreciated by the real estate industry is the enduring commitment of the mayor, who comes year after year to do conferences, business meetings, investors lunch. Here you have him doing a conference when he was presenting the redevelopment plan for the Pardieu Central Business District in 2011. And this is, as the quote suggests, and the quote is taken from an interview I did with an investment manager from a real estate investment trust, a French REIT. This is very much appreciated and very much liked by the investment industry. So I'm not going to read the quote, but she made clear enough that it was a really good thing for her, unlike Paris, for example, to have the mayor to commit year after year to showcase its city region. So this was a key aspect to showcase the city region, but the other one was the use of external input from local brokers and developers, which were engaged in a partnership with the Metropolitan Authority to help the staffers from the Metropolitan Authority to design their stand, to choose which project they will present, to polish the arguments, the selling arguments they will use during business meetings with international investors. And in that respect, the brokers and developers, because they have professional resources and legitimacy, were seen as key partners by the Metropolitan Authority. So during these years, I've been focusing on, but just to make clear, because I'm speaking mostly of the first term of Gerard Collomb, but the Grand Lyon is obviously still going to the MIPIM years after years. During this first term, the MIPIM acted as a key platform whereby the Metropolitan Authority, Economic Department, and the Executive Cabinet were converted to the investment standards, both through a proactive strategy, because they organized face-to-face meetings, they wrote policy memos on what the investment strategies of the different funds were, but also because they were very keen on developing this partnership with local intermediaries. One immediate impact, and the most visible impact, when you follow the city branding brochures, for example, that were distributed by the Metropolitan Authority, is the adjustment of the portfolios of projects, because there have been less and less projects that have been presented. And for the Metropolitan Authority, this was a direct advice taken from the local intermediaries, the idea being that you need to showcase just one or maybe two projects, okay, maybe 4 projects, but not much, because otherwise the investors will think that there is an oversupply and that they won't have their properties leased up, and then that they won't have the required cash flow from their portfolio. But I will argue, and that's what's interesting with this case study, is that the impacts were far more wide-reaching than just the MIPIM, just the portfolios of the project, and because the economic development staff was also involved in 2 other key activities and policies. One is in participating into drafting the strategies for regeneration projects, and the other one is the design of this metropolitan strategy in 2008. So put otherwise, because they were exposed to this investment industry culture and standards, they were able to take what they learned at the MIPIM and put it into the projects on the ground. A very clear-cut example in that respect is the Cara de Soie urban regeneration project, which is a typical urban regeneration project. Nothing exceptional about it. It's Paris Central, it's in red, just outside the ring road. It's a huge project whose main aim is to recycle industrial land into a mixed-use neighborhood and giving this neighborhood a new status and a new identity at the metropolitan scale. And to do so, one key aspect was to build an office hub near the transportation. So this is a map with the first office developments, and so they are, as you can see, very much clustered across the transportation hub, whereas the area is so huge, all the new office property are clustered. Why is that so? I would argue that it's a result of the consensus between, on the one hand, developers who obviously caters to their investment clientele, so who have completely internalized what the expectations of their investment clientele is, and on the other one, a consensus with urban planners, which were drawn by this economic development staff to create a new address on the investment market through building this critical mass of offices, which is having large standardized offices clustered around the transportation hub. And the result is quite clear-cut. So all the properties that were or are being currently developed, most of them, unless one, has been bought by property funds, investment managers, or pension funds. And the consensus resulted in a project whose, at least for when it comes to offices, is very much skewed towards what the investment market is expected. That is big buildings, well, big for this specific regional markets, because remember that this market is not that big compared to Paris. Very standardized offices. They have to be liquid, so they have to be flexible like this one, because if the tenant leaves, you need to be able to release it maybe to 2 or 3 different tenants. So you need to be able, as an investment manager, to cut the building, for example, in 3 different parts in order to lease it to 3 different businesses. And these businesses, most of the time, are very much blue chip businesses, that is large corporations who will be able to prove they have a strong financial records and that they can lease up a whole building. And that building is stereotypical in that respect, not only for the flexibility aspect, but also because it was leased to one single tenant, which is the French multinational Alstom Transports. So this is the aspect about enforcing premium value on the ground. The third and last aspect I want to touch upon is this idea that which came at the end of Gérard Collon's first term, and which was then at the beginning of his second term, when he was re-elected in 2008, turned into a specific strategy and dedicated instrument aimed at regulating the supply of offices, not only in individual projects like the Cara de Soie, but also at the metropolitan scale. And once again, the idea was to sell the premium value to investors, meaning that you will have steady returns because us, as a Metropolitan Authority, will make sure that we regulate the supply of space, both in terms of space, obviously. So having just a few hotspots, concentrating all new office construction within these few hotspots, and also regulation in terms of time, which is we will make sure that not all the buildings get constructed the same year, but we will try to make have a building in this project this year and in another one in another project the year after, etc., etc. So this is what they came up with. As you can see, the Cara de Soie has been selected as one of the top hotspots, and that the idea is that to render the city market legible for distant investors, and making sure that they get the idea that there are only 4 main projects, trying also to make sure that the projects are not competing against each other. So they have the Metropolitan Economic Development Department has been thinking about which economic sector should be privileged in one specific project and in another one, so has to make sure that they don't compete one with each other. And this is just another graphic representation, another figure, sorry, about this idea about showing these investors, because this is taken from a brochure that the Metropolitan Authority is giving out, for example, on the MIPIM, and so showing that they have understood that this is about regulating and generating future steady income returns. I don't have time to enter into the detail, just to say that this metropolitan strategy was not that new, because, for example, in the Cara de Soie, they were doing a few years before the official strategy. They were already implementing this type of strategy, but it just has generated a reinforcement of taking into account the investors' requirement, not only by reinforcing the articulation between economic development and urbanism, which allows the economic department to gives its input into specific urban project, but also by extending, for example, the participation of local and property brokers into designing the whole strategy. So just a quick words to conclude. So in the case study, we have seen that indeed intermediation is key to financialization. I have focused on the role of local brokers and developers, which were not only key into making the markets work, into selling and buying the different properties between investors, but also into really helping and converting the metropolitan economic department into being more familiar and being more attuned to what the investment industry is expecting. And I think this is quite consistent with what you said, Rachel, in your book. And the idea is that growth in this specific case is not what you talk in the book. So it's in that respect, I think there may be a difference. It's not a boom bust as of yet type of growth. It's more a steady growth in order to enforce the liquidity of assets. So and in that respect, this is also what the Metropolitan Authority is trying to sell to investors. They are trying to develop this identity and sell, we are not Paris, we are not Barcelona, which is in that respect not a model anymore because of the housing crash which happened there, but we are a city region which can offer you diversification and steady returns. The last point, but this may be more for discussing between us, is that since I have argued that part of internationalization, given the emphasis on real estate market and entrepreneurialism, unfolds through financialization, this kind of tweaks what the geography or the dimensions of internationalization can be. And we can also maybe start thinking about what kind of internationalization, what geography of internationalization does this generate? For example, MIPIM is supposed to be an international property fairs. Well, 90% of attendance is European. So, for example, I think US attendance is between 3 to 5%, which is not that much. So maybe it's more about regional globalization in that case. And I also wanted to make clear that in the case of the Lyon City region, the share of international investors was quite limited, as it is only 1/4 of the investment. And when it is, for example, 10 percentage points more in Paris. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the both of you. I think you really kept up with the challenge of taking these three big words seriously and try and see their interconnections and their limits, the overlaps, and how actually they may not seem to be working together. I think we really had two strong cases of the role of local governments in mediating, facilitating the interconnections between property markets and capital markets. And now it's quite clear that a large array of local policies may be used to facilitate this interconnection. Branding, financial incentives, and or the use of regulatory urban powers of planning. through zoning, for instance. There are also differences in your cases that we may want to stress, and you've touched upon it, Antoine, but I think I would like to reflect on this too. On the one hand, we have a growth machine fueled by finance capital, where the local government is only too happy to support massive development and then to clean up the mess. That was Chicago. Whereas in the Lyon case, there's this strong emphasis, the attempt to distinguish the city region from all the other speculative kind of developments. Now, whether this is only a branding strategy or whether it's they have power over this, I'm wondering. So that leads me to two questions, one each. How is it possible, Rachel, in the world that a city region, a government, a local government, does actually not try to reassure property and financial markets that they're not going to crash into a wall? I mean, are they just, is it because they're betting on the fact that we only have a 10-year window and that we have to make the best of it? And is it just cynicism? Is it just that they thought that prices would go up forever, as the common wisdom was at this point in time? I'm really surprised. I mean, so that's the first question. And with you, Antoine, it's just the opposite. Do you really think that the city region has got the power to prevent the formation of a boom and then a bust at some point, in spite of all the talks at the MIPIM? So these were my two questions, and then we'll open up the floor. Why not, if you can?
Sure. I mean, I do think there's a variety of factors for why local government doesn't play more of that kind of caretaker role for the entire market. I think that, and I think this has to do with seeing, right? There was that great book by James Scott called Seeing Like a State, and which I assigned to my students, which is sort of trying to understand kind of, I mean, in Foucauldian terms, sort of governmentality. I don't think the city of Chicago was viewing the real estate market as a real estate market. When you talk to them about, when you talk to planners, when you talk to city officials, they look at the city in terms of submarkets, so specific neighborhoods and specific projects. But there's nobody who's kind of looking out for the entirety, and it's ironic because in urban planning, at least, we had inherited something called a comprehensive model of the city, which was supposed to take into account, I mean, even though that model was somewhat discredited, but the sort of 1960s was a sort of heyday for that sort of thinking comprehensively and thinking about the urban in terms of all these interlocking systems and having this kind of big picture view. So I think there's that question of just, again, it's I think almost an epistemological or a kind of government, sort of a rationality, sort of how you think about the government. And I think there are institutional reasons for that, which is that we have a 4-year electoral timeline. So even though we had we had the same mayor in power for many terms, Mayor Daley was in power from 1989 through 2011. So it's a long period of time, but even so, the expectation is, in 4 years, I could lose my job, or the city council, the 50 representatives from each of these submarkets who play a very important role. We didn't talk about that in Chicago in terms of making these zoning changes and providing the building permits. I mean, basically, you can't build anything in Chicago unless you get a letter signing off from your local alderman, your city councilor. But they have, again, sort of the 4-year time frame. So people would argue that the time frame of local government is actually much shorter than that of engineers or the developers who may plan on owning their property for a longer period of time. And then there's just a sense, as you all know, in the United States and I think this goes back to a kind of the liberalism or the sort of a market, always looking for market solutions, an idea that the state can't know better than the market, that they don't have any kind of superior intelligence or expertise that would allow them to anticipate a bust and therefore prevent one. So I mean, I found it quite striking that in Lyon, you had the local government sort of playing that, you know, kind of, you know, sort of regulating the market so that not too much of these new projects would come online at any one time, that they were kind of, they were sort of creating a kind of timeline, which I think does provide more assurance to investors, whereas in the Chicago model, it was like any and all kind of fanning the flames, whoever wants to come, and then, oh no, it crashed, oh no, and now we have to turn our attention to all of these half-built construction projects and developer foreclosures and bail them out. So it was all this activity on one hand trying to heat up the market, and then all this activity trying to sort of, you know, clean up the pieces of the ruin that was left in the wake of the bust.
Okay, so the Metropolitan Authority have the means to enforce actually this vision, which is also it's at the same time it's a city branding strategy, obviously, but I would argue there is more to it. I remember what you told me when you went at the MIPIM 2016 and you overheard that Cologne was having this meeting with the local developers, and he was very angry at them because they were building too much in Gerland, which was not his priority, because his priority at that time was to redevelop the central business district. And that's an example of that it doesn't necessarily have all the powers. The city has, of course, the Metropolitan Authority has still has the building permits, but the classical means of coercion in the French case, which will be land ownership, is declining. There is less and less public land ownership. Actually, out of the four main projects I show you, the Metropolitan Authority only owns complete land in Confluence. So, and in the other projects, it's developers directly deal generally with initial landowners. So, in that sense, of course, it's one of the limits of his strategy. But then I will argue that because they have been building this regime, these networks which involves personal ties, long-term relationship, they can also play on that in order to try to coerce or at least to have the developers believe and adhere and stick to their vision. And that's actually what one of the people I was talking about during an interview said. It's like, said, of course, we have this strategy, but it doesn't matter that it's not applied to the ladder from A to Z. And what is important is that we are able to enroll the local developers and also the investors within this vision so that they sort of internalize what we are expecting. But of course, this is a very flexible and limited way of coercing and making sure that urban redevelopment goes towards where you want it to go.
Okay, so now we'll take a few questions, at least 3. So I'm going to. So can you raise your hand again? So there's Nicolas back. Okay, Natasha. Well, we can start from.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these interesting talks. I have a question for each speaker. First to Rachel. When the developers get they get a higher floor area ratio or whatever they have they receive a change in the regulation. Do they negotiate? Does the local authority negotiate asking some counterpart from the developer, or are they just happy to get their project delivered? This is my question to you.
Okay.
And then to, what's your name?
Antoine.
Oh, yeah, Antoine, yeah. Could you please elaborate more on the notion of premium value, because as I see, for example, taking the case of Le Cara de Soie, it seems that it's more like risk premium than any other premium value. I mean, it's a second-rank city, very narrow office market, not central location, and single occupant, which is for me a very high risk altogether. So if you could just elaborate on this idea of premium value. Thank you.
Should we take several questions?
Yeah.
Sure. Well.
Anne-Carrière, I worked in PUCA several years ago and in Annales de la Recherche Urbaine, and I followed the story of Lyon, and I think there is a cultural and political dimension which was built before the arrival of Colomb, which is very important because the case of Lyon was erected by the national state as the premium for France. The strategic plan of development, for instance, was the first one to give a unified idea of the metropolis. The concept of French metropolis was built in Lyon by people. There were people from the center, and they were pushed out before Colomb for a little kind of corruption. But they did a lot with the socialist state, Mitterrand, about public spaces, about working in the working class suburbs and with the Arabic people, ethnic conflicts and everything. So there was really a cultural and political production, which of course was not built in a way, or very little, but prepared everybody and all national professionals to go in this idea that this is the model.
Nicolas, je crois, as well.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I had two questions, maybe for both of you, and maybe it's linked with the previous one. The first was because we talked this morning about neoliberalization and the difficulty to grasp, to define, to investigate on this matter. And I would like to talk about maybe internationalization, and because the question is, what is internationalized at the end in these processes that you are looking at? It is scale, actors, or processes? Because Antoine, in your last slide, you asked the question, what kind of internationalization? And the second was domestic market. So I was wondering if how you define this scale or this space as internationalized. And my second question maybe would be about the role of urban government, but not in relations maybe with the private actors, but maybe the question of the autonomy or the constraint in relations with the state. So that's quite the question that just raised. Where is the state in the internationalization of cities in the process of financialization that you are looking at? And yes, the question of the autonomy or the proactive or at the contrary, the constraint.
The central state?
The central state, yes.
Well, please go ahead.
I think just to answer your question, Nicolas, that the central government, even though in the United States the federal system is so different than it is in France, where the local government has after many decades of devolution, has more power, particularly over this area, and very little interference from the federal government. But the federal government in the United States is still in charge of monetary policy. And that's where we see a lot of the main sort of, if you want to call it, neoliberal reforms, or I call it, liberalization of trade and in the circulation of money. I think that's really where we see the lowering of barriers that started in the 1980s and just accelerated in the 90s, that allowed for more sort of foreign capital to come in. So so organizations like the Securities and Exchange Commission, These are national agents, the Federal Trade Commission, the Treasury Department. They were all involved in administrative rulings that helped to kind of create this kind of financial architecture. And then after the crash, the Congress was involved in passing the Dodd-Frank reforms to financial regulation, which still protected a lot of what I was talking about, these processes of securitization. There are more rules now that banks have to follow in terms of holding on to more of their mortgages, more efforts at transparency to make sure that these kinds of epic crashes won't occur again. But it was very much watered down, through a process of political haggling. But so I think that the national government plays a really key role, not in terms of the sort of planning and property market sort of stuff, that's really relegated to the local authority, the municipal government in the case of the US, but in terms of allowing for these kinds of financial flows to, like I say, sort of take hold in particular cities and places in the United States. And then just getting back to the issue of they're called these planned developments. Sometimes you see them called planned unit developments. But this is this sort of negotiated zoning, which I do think is a form of sort of, making these kind of government impositions more flexible, creating exceptions, making it more informal, right? So we associate informality with, shanty towns and low-income places and built environments, but I would say that in the center of one of the second or third largest office market in the United States, you see several instances of this kind of informality. But yes, there is a quid pro quo. The expectation is that the local government provides a density bonus, so more FAR to the developer, and in exchange, the developer provides some kind of public benefit. But that public benefit can be defined in many, there's no standard for what that is. It's very much negotiated. So in the case of Trump, what he had to do was reconstruct a bridge that was on the bottom of, on the sort of the base level of this big skyscraper he was building. And he also had to make some very minor design changes so that the building would fit in more with the streetscape, even though if you go and visit it, or you couldn't tell from my images, it really stands out like a sore thumb. So, but the expectation is we give you this, but you give us this. But it's all dependent on your representatives and what they're fighting for, and they're often sort of outnumbered or out-expertised in terms of the legal representation that the developer is able to hire, and so they can water down the requirements that the developer has to make, the concessions that the developer has to make in exchange for this benefit.
Antoine? Okay, to start with, Natasha, thank you for your question. It's my fault, actually. I should have made clear from the start that the premium value is actually taken from interviews. It's actually valeur sûre. This is the slogan they used on MIPIM. So this is what they are trying, and we can see that valeur sûre and premium value is not exactly the same thing. So maybe I should have made clear from the start that I was replicating or using the empirical data, but I wanted to suggest that they were really embarked upon this idea of selling the market and selling not only the market, but once again steady returns. And you are right in pointing that the project appears risky, and that the local government, actually the metropolitan government, did everything it could to make it less risky. So making the infrastructure coming, then cluster a lot of what has been done, clustering the offices, is undertaken in order to make it less risky and to attract investors. And this was also this also included at the very start of the project drawing new tenants that were scattered among the city region into new developments, so to make sure the buildings were leased up so far. Yes, Nicola, tricky question about internationalization. I kind of forgot the question. I think you asked for a definition of internationalization. Is that it? I mean,
what about your case is international?
I mean, what is international? This is what I've tried to touch upon. I mean, most of the investment flow isn't international. When they go to the MIPIM, they don't meet. I mean, they meet European investors, but is that international? I leave that up to you. No, one thing interesting, taking a step back in considering the financialization of the French real estate commercial property market, is that financialization took place late in the 90s after the bubble exploded, and it was mostly because US funds, opportunistic funds, went into the market and bought a lot of distressed assets. So, for example, debt or unfinished buildings, and they have used market finance techniques and these techniques have then spread throughout the whole investment markets. So, of course, pension funds were there before, but they were not necessarily considering their assets and their portfolio as they do now. They were not using, for example, that much discounted cash flow techniques, and so on and so forth. So I guess maybe in that way, this is another aspect of internationalization, which is once again a very specific internationalization, which when it comes down to the point is Anglo-American financialized capitalism. And regarding your second point vis-a-vis the state, and the state was a central, of course, is central in this process of financialization. Christopherson et al. In a paper in 2013 suggests that financialization is a policy project, and in a way, financialization, of course, is a policy which aims at bridging economic sectors with circuits of capital that tapped into financial markets. And in making and then we can start discussing, is that neoliberal or not? Because as early as the 70s, the French state already created some investment vehicles to use public monies, so yours and mine, in the SCPI, Société de Placement Immobilier, Société Civile de Porto, and the SIC later. But lately, the state also has, of course, not of course, but has kept up with creating new investment vehicles with a strong emphasis on liquidity, which is the case of the SIC, which is the French model, which is the French version of the REITs. And so in the mid-2000s, the French state created the French Real Estate Investment Trust and the OPCI, which are another other type of funds. So yeah, the state is key in making up, as Gotham will say, this infrastructure, this institutional infrastructure, which helps the capital to travel from financial markets, and may they be global, to the French markets and to urban regeneration projects.
Okay, but it was a small remark trying to connect this afternoon's discussion with this morning's, with a small puzzle. In France, according to the last population census, the population growth in the country was primarily in what they call middle-sized cities, which is very, very small compared to what any city we've been discussing today. So I think maybe you already have an answer to my question, but I think it's an interesting direction of research to understand the others of what we've been discussing, the others of financialization, internationalization, neoliberalization, because I suspect that in these middle-sized cities, which is, I don't know, between 10,000 and 100,000 inhabitants, so very, well, small cities, and even probably less than 100,000, it's entirely other processes that are at play in urban production, urban growth, and economic development, etc. So it's just a remark to connect with the discussion we had this morning. Thanks.
Hi, I just had two directions of question. The one is about the maybe different kinds of circuits of investment in cities, which would be sovereign wealth funds or state investment from places with large state-owned enterprises and so on. Does this function differently? And then the other one is about the interface, and I'm quite interested in this between these transnational financialization and the sort of regulating effect they have on the outcomes in the city, and the fact that they have to be locally meaningful. So in your case, for example, you have asset managers who have to manage property so that people occupy them. You have to have houses and flats that people occupy. You might have planners who desire to construct a very localized sense of vernacular urban qualities they love, or that will appeal, will make a city they believe in. And even the most globalized investors are heavily invested in some localities. So that interface is really tricky to handle and understand. So I just wondered if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the asset has to be both at the same time, right? It has to be use and exchange value. It can't be like, oh, there's some segment that's all about use value and utility, and then there's this other sector, a segment of the real estate market that's just being transacted. It's like you can be both simultaneously, use and exchange value. And so that I think that you have actors sort of representing these assets in different ways. So I think it's a lot about this sort of, I call it sort of performing distinction at the local level, which I'm not when I use the word performing, I don't intend to mean that it's somehow false or artificial, but it's sort of you play up the distinctions between this building and the building right next to it, so that you're trying to attract the tenant. But then when the building's mortgage is being transacted, it looks as cookie cutter as you can imagine, and it's all just sort of boiled down to the sort of leasable square footage and trying to minimize the amount of public space that it has, because that would, obviously cut into its cash flows, and sort of the various ways in which, there's certain sort of signifiers that I think are used in both of these realms, but it's sometimes there's not that interface. They're sort of separated processes conducted by separate groups of actors.
Olivier, I just wanted to react on what you said. Of course, we have to think of other cities which may depend on other circuits of capital. I just want to make clear that even in what we come to think as global region, whether it be Lyon or Paris, of course, the financial circuits don't cover all the space. I mean, there are coexistent, Ball will say, the structures of building provision. There are coexistent circuits of which finance the urban built environment, and not every office, for example, in the Paris city region, is being financed through this specific one. Moving on to Jenny's question, I'm not sure about the one you asked. Is there a difference when the state is acting as a primary actor? Is that it?
Well, sovereign wealth, I mean, so you mentioned some states kind of Anglo-American financialized capitalism, blah, blah, but I mean, a lot of the stuff that's flowing around the world is not that. It's from Dubai or China. Sovereign wealth funds are huge investors in property markets across London. So what goes on with them? Is there some different thing? I mean, I've read some things about, say, a different kind of approach, a more patient capital approach. There was a nice article in Economic Geography about investment in Germany from sovereign wealth funds, because they match with the formats of sort of more family-oriented industrial activity and so on. So is there something different that goes on when you have this?
I guess you could say that sovereign wealth funds, for example, are more patient because they want to get future value, rental value, and they are less short-sighted, and they may tend to withhold the property in their portfolio for a longer period of time. Although I would argue that, for example, as far as I know, pension funds or insurance firms in the French market have significantly embarked into arbitrage and having their portfolio rotating on a much shorter basis, just keeping the properties for 6 to 8 years, and that's supposed to be long term. But maybe that's very specific to the French case, and there's certainly there certainly is a difference with sovereign wealth fund, which are a specific case in the case in point, I think.
Yeah, different kinds of capital have different sort of risk return profiles. They require different sort of hurdle rates for what they consider to be a good investment, and they have different time horizons. They're willing to hold on to an asset for longer periods of time. So I associate sovereign wealth funds with other kinds of institutional investors like pension funds. And it's not just a preference. It's not just the sort of based on the identity, but these again are sort of political legal regimes that determine what governments can do with their money or what pension funds can do with their money. And that's another area where, at least in the United States, the national government, the central government's changing regulations will either loosen or tighten those kinds of the sort of parameters by which the financial sponsors or fiduciaries select different kinds of investments. So there were some major changes in what's called ERISA, which governs pension fund activity, that sort of loosened the strictures of what they could invest in. So my pension fund, for example, I'm lucky to still have one, most don't, could make riskier investments. But traditionally, those kinds of investors bought into things like infrastructure and stuff that had maybe a lower rate of return, but a steady and more stable one.
Okay. Actually, could I step in the conversation as well? You said something about how there must be some kind of use value underlying in a way, because and it's absolutely clear that in order to have exchange values, you need what they call investors an income stream. So they definitely rely on use values. Now, however, we may make the hypothesis, at least we could test it, and we have some evidence that would tend to show that exchange values at some point actually select what type of use values can be welcome in the buildings and infrastructure in which these asset managers invest. For instance, Antoine, you talked about the blue chip companies. Well, this is a clear example where an asset manager need an income stream, but they have preferences, which are actually not just out of the blue, but that depend on the texture of capital, what they are using, and a series of risk-return expectations that they have. But then these have very clear selective effects on what use values may be occurring in their premises. So blue chip tenants rather than your usual startup or your local community association, they are actually screening who gets access to their premises. And as in some places they tend to be maybe a driving or an important circuit of capital financing some areas, well then it may end up with places where you just can't develop certain types of occupations, certain types of activities, and certain types of dwellings as well. So maybe the cohabitation between the use and exchange values is not a peaceful one. Okay, it's 4:30, so I mean we can talk for quite a long time, but we could also do it around a coffee or a tea if you want to, unless you have other questions, like really pressing ones. Okay, so we can take 2 minutes and get to the coffee break. We wish to thank you very much for your presence. I thought the erosion